WNYC-TV presents About the Arts with Barbara Lee Diamondstein.
Welcome to About the Arts. I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein, and our guest today is the author of a wonderful new novel. He's Robert Kotlowitz, and the book is called The Boardwalk, and it has been greeted, I think, with extraordinary critical acclaim. One especially apt reviewer said that Kotlowitz is a voyeur of social manners, a young Henry James with a difference, the ability to understand not only what's going on around him, but what's going on inside him too. That's not enough to describe Bob Kotlowitz. His talents are protean. In addition to writing a prize-winning first novel, he is also the Vice President for Programming of Channel 13. Bob, why don't you tell us how you came to write this particular novel?
Well, as you know, there had been, and as you said, there was a first novel preceding it, which dealt with an aspect of European life that interested me a great deal. I come from a family and a home that had a considerable European orientation when I was a child, and I wrote a novel that, in certain aspects, described my father's life as he came out of Poland and went to England and then to Palestine during World War I had then considered doing a direct sequel to that book, since it probably stopped rather than ended in an authentic way, and decided not to, just to pick up and create new characters in 1939, which was the year that World War II opened. And for me, the most significant year, I think, of the 20th century so far. And at my age at that time, very, very important to me, because I was terrifically involved in what was happening in Ethiopia, Spain, the Japanese going into Manchukuo, and Hitler's rise to power, and the fate of the Jews in Nazi Germany. At the same time, I was also a prototypical American adolescent, doing all the ordinary things, going to a prototypical American high school and vacationing in a place like Atlantic City, which in 1939, when none of us had access to jet planes in Europe and the Caribbean, etc., had a kind of glamour and excitement that was extremely attractive. So the impulse for this novel was really an attempt to capture the magic of Atlantic City, the sort of coming of age of an adolescent American boy against the backdrop of a world going to war. If that doesn't sound too pretentious.
Is it fair to describe you and literary method as a modern Henry James?
I couldn't possibly respond to that.
Well, what are your objectives? Are you writing literary sociology?
Well, my objectives are first to tell stories about people about whom I care deeply, and in these stories to create a social texture comprised of details that I observed all my life, details that come out of characters and the way they behave, and details that emerge from the very ordinary daily things with which we live: the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the movies we choose to go to see, how long we stay on the beach, how much sun we can take when we do.
And one of your characters can't take very much at all.
Exactly, and suffers greatly, and what it is like to wake up in the morning in Atlantic City, and what it is like to go to sleep, and what it is like to become exhausted from that sun. That is not what dominates in the book, but those things count a great deal to me. They're very important. I think that they cement life, in a sense, together.
One of the characters talks about another kind of cement of life. He keeps on advising young Teddy Lewin that, in fact, it's one of the few lines that I recall recurring in this really beautifully written, sure, spare novel. And the line was Gustav Levi, is that how you pronounce his name? It had an I ending, that's why I said that. I know how to pronounce that word generally. Knew how he instructs young Teddy to hold fast to the nature of ordinary things. When he says that, what does he, you mean?
Well, what Gus Levy means at that point, it's a when he says that, it is a response to the declaration, it's a response to the invasion of Poland by Germany. And Gus Levy is in a terrifically disturbed state over the situation, and distraught at the kind of reliance on the phenomenal that is coming out of Nazi Germany, the dependence on the bloodlust, the return to primitive ways of living. And what he does is say to this dining table within this Atlantic City hotel that it is essential now for them to hold on to ordinary things, because that's what will get them through the war. If they hold on to these things and rely on them and put their trust in them, not to become like the Germans.
Is there a larger theme in one's life about holding on to ordinary things that you
Well, there's
ascribe
an
to?
amusing story. A friend of ours who moved to Beverly Hills 6 months ago, unhappily as it turned out, called us once a few months ago and was complaining about life out there. And my wife jokingly said, well, wait till you read Bob's book. There's an opening line, you know, that says, hold fast to the nature of ordinary things because they console you. This friend of mine says, that may be the way he writes, but it's not the way he lives.
How does a novelist, speaking about the way you live, hold down a full-time job? Can you imagine Henry James running Channel 13?
No, but Henry James had another life besides the writing life that was terrifically strenuous and demanding and required his full attention. I mean, how many dinner parties did he go to in 1 year in London? Did he brag about once?
Well, let's talk about Robert Kotlowitz, who doesn't spend his life going to dinner parties. Give us some idea, an example of what your schedule is like.
My schedule is very simple. I work in the office before 9 every morning, and I am there till long after 6 generally every evening, working on the development of program ideas and their funding and the production of programs, the acquiring of programs, negotiating, then scheduling them in New York and dealing with all the ramifications of public television in terms of PBS and all those organizations that mix the pot of public television up. And all those concerns touch my interests at almost every point in one way or another. Music, drama, public affairs, science, theater, etc. I lead a very hectic life during the week, and my wife and I go out and go to the theater, have dinner parties, etc. But comes Friday, it begins to shut down, and I get home Friday night and we lead a reclusive life until Monday morning. Not that I write every minute of the weekend, but we create a kind of elbow space around us in which we can take long walks or go to sleep early, or I can write for 4 hours and then take a break and then go back to it. It's just a time in which there are no demands permitted.
Were both novels written on weekends? During
Both
weekends?
novels were written on weekends and on vacation times, and I'm ruthless about those time periods.
How long did it take to write The Boardwalk?
It took 3 years to write The Boardwalk.
And how long in your head?
40 perhaps, 35.
You mentioned earlier that you found 1939 the single most important date of this century. Do you still hold to that? I mean, do you ascribe any importance to 1945 or 1963 or...
Oh, they were all important years, but I'm talking about my personal life. 1939 was the watershed for me. I went on to be one of the last draftees in World War II, and I was in the infantry during the war. Went to Europe to fight in a war that I believed in ideologically, and received an education under fire that was very important to me. And probably transformed me in very important ways. It just was a major external episode for me, and for millions of other people, and for the world itself, politically and otherwise.
When you talked of your job at Channel 13, you just said that it touches on the range of your interests, from music to theater to literature. And when I introduced you, I said, and not excessively, I indicated that there were a range of talents that you had. Why don't you describe some of the work that you've done before you came to Channel 13?
That long checkered...
Isn't so
well,
checkered. You're not an accidental novelist, is the
No, I'm
point.
not an accidental novelist, and my professional history, the career history, has been primarily involved with print. And I was, as you know, managing editor of Harper's Magazine for 6 or 7 years and had a monthly column in the magazine for part of that time.
And what was that column about?
Performing arts. It was about theater, about film, about dance and music. And when I wasn't writing a column, I did a certain amount of reportage for the magazine. I went back to the D-Day beaches with 4th Infantry Division veterans and had a wonderful trip, and I think did one of the best pieces I've ever written.
And what was that piece?
It was called Taps at Utah Beach. And I did a piece about what it was like to grow up in Baltimore in a very
This is in that
insular-
Harper's series,
Yes,
wasn't
it was the first in the Harper series of going home pieces. It was called Baltimore Boy and was, in fact, the beginning of doing that first novel. That's really how the first novel emerged. And I had been senior editor and one of the founding editors of Show magazine before that, where I also did a lot of reportage and a minimum amount of critical work. So I've been writing nonfiction. I've been doing journalism for a long time.
Well, it's said, and you have said, that your work does tend to be autobiographical. Is the Boardwalk, are you Teddy Lewin?
Certainly.
Are you his big brother, too?
I'm Teddy Lewin's big brother, too, and I'm a lot of other characters in the book, but that's true, I think, of every novel. But Teddy Lewin, in an essential way, is me, and there's no point in saying it's a mixture of this and that, although it is, but essentially it is me.
Well, in the arts, you perform as a literary man. Since you do that in television, do you have a special desire to translate literature into television programs?
Well, we, as you know, we do a lot of literary, or a lot of dramatic adaptations of literary works, either through acquiring it through the BBC, which has a lot of money to do these things and does them very well, or at last on our own. We are co-producing Dickens' Hard Times with Granada Television now, and we're doing...
That is in process?
That is in process and coming to completion, in fact. Will be finished in about 3 weeks.
And scheduled to be aired when?
May. We'll be on the air very quickly with it.
How long a series is that?
4 parts, 4 one-hour episodes. And we are in the middle of producing a series called The Writer in America, with a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, in which we are doing half-hour programs on writers in their own environment, just informal portraits of them at work and living their daily lives.
And who are the writers?
Well, so far we have one on Robert Duncan, who is a San Francisco poet, on John Gardner, the novelist, on Janet Flanner, and on Eudora Welty.
Janet Flanner done in France?
No, done on Park Avenue in New York, when she was here last year. And we've just received a grant to do 4 more, and we are just beginning the plans to get the 4 done, and then we will have a series, a substantial series.
And when is that scheduled to be?
Well, that will probably not be finished for another 12 months, and rather than put them on piecemeal as specials, I would rather do them as a series, so I think they'll probably be on the air next spring.
What writers, living or past, do you consider your literary mentors?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I really don't think in those terms. I have writers I admire greatly. I admire Norman Mailer, I admire Bill Stein's work. I read only 19th century fiction when I am working on my own novels, because I am too impressionable, and I am always afraid that I'm going to pick something up and then have to work my way out of it stylistically for the next 2 months, and I don't have that kind of time to fool around with. But I have, for the past 5 years, have been reading a lot of Dickens, if not all of it, a lot of Trollope, and half of those. Now, I've read 27 Trollope novels in the past 5 years, and for the sheer pleasure of it. But the really significant influences have been, well, one, Dickens as a novelist, Tolstoy as a novelist, and as whatever else you can call him, and it's very hard to think of the term that defines him, but as that personality that really straddled the 19th century in such a giant way. And then there are stylists like Turgenev, whom I admire very much, and whose work has sort of been lurking in my soul, if that's the expression, all these years, while I try to retrieve from that what I can use myself and transform into my own personal terms. Style is important to me.
That's obvious. Since the subject matter of your book, The Boardwalk, and your earlier novel, Somewhere Else, is so rooted in ethnic circumstances, namely Jewish, do you consider yourself a part of that genre that is referred to as the Jewish
Do I
novelist?
identify with
Yes.
that? Not as a group, no, but I am
Well,
a
how
writer.
do you place yourself in that
Well,
spectrum?
I am a writer, and I
was
am
really
Jewish.
expecting you to deny that. Not the fact that you're a writer or your own ethnicity,
Right,
but your placement in that whole spectrum.
I don't feel placed in that spectrum because I do my own work as everyone else does their own work. The attempt to write the first novel came from a very strong impulse to try to make a record of Eastern European life in novelistic form before that whole thing vanished. And it is vanishing with the generation that preceded us as they slowly go. I mean, the records, you go to Yivo at 86th Street and 5th Avenue and walk in there, and there you discover in the walls of this mansion a record of a whole world that existed for hundreds of years in Eastern Europe, and it's literally fabulous. And that's what I dealt with in the first book. But in the second book, I wrote about Jewish life, but I wrote about many, many other things at the same time. So it is very hard.
Well, in that one phrase, and without identifying or connecting you with someone else's work, the whole world of our fathers kind of view, this large spectrum of experience, is really manifest in much of your work. But somewhat to my surprise, some of Teddy's relatives in the Boardwalk reflected a rather traditional, stereotypical ethnic view. There is a scene when, at least with me, the most lingering recollection is an overabundance of flesh and refreshments.
Well, I mean, you know, Jews in America are like many other people in America. They are desperate to become Americans. And one of the ways one stakes out an American role that makes you feel comfortable is to have money and all the good things of American life, many of which make their appearance in material form. That's in no way a judgment. And why should Jews be less hungry for that than anybody else? And it's true that there are characters in this book who are perfect middle-class representations of what is best and worst in this country, and we all know it. We've all lived with it all our lives. I assume that that's what you're talking about.
Does Teddy feel like an outsider?
Sure.
Economically, ethnically?
He feels, he is, first of all, an artist in the book. He is a pianist and a very gifted one.
Mr. Kotlowitz studied at the Peabody Conservatory as
I'm
a
not a
young
gifted
man.
pianist, but I did study. And he is beginning to develop that sense of being an outsider, which is very, very painful for artists, no matter how much we all tend to wear it as a banner of our separateness and individuality. It is nonetheless not easy to feel that you are outside the mainstream, and there are moments when every artist feels this desperate longing to belong and be part of it and go through ordinary life the way everybody else goes through ordinary life. And the hero of this novel, if that's the word, not hero, is beginning to feel this in a very real way and doesn't know how to come to terms with it and doesn't even know that it's an experience that's shared with other people yet.
Why did you choose The Boardwalk as the title?
In fact, it wasn't my title. I have a desperate time titling my own books and pieces, and had come up with a list of perhaps 40 titles which I had given to my editor. And finally, my editor, who was Judith Jones at Alfred Knopf, came back to me. She said, "Why don't you just call it The Boardwalk?" And I said, "Of course. Why don't I?"
Well, it is an apt title, but how did you arrive at it? Perhaps you'd tell us.
Well, the book, as Barbara Lee described, deals with, in one aspect, deals with life in Atlantic City of people on vacation. And life in Atlantic City on vacation has three elements. One is the life in the hotel, which is full of clamor and fighting and excitement and fun and laughter and people. The second element is the daytime life on the beach with the sun and the water and that sea. And the third element is the boardwalk, which is a metaphor for life in a way, on which everybody who's in Atlantic City makes a nighttime appearance of one kind or another and translates their own longings, their own personalities. It was wonderful to be a child and witness that scene on the boardwalk.
Well, for Teddy, the boardwalk is the road not taken as well.
It's a place of discovery. It's a place on the way to
Under
someplace
the boardwalk
else.
is a place of
and
discovery.
under the boardwalk is a cranny, a cave, in which the kids hide out from the adults and do all kinds of kid things, mainly having to do with sex.
You mentioned earlier that while you're reading, writing a book, that you restrict your reading in this interregnum, so to speak, before you take on your next novel, I assume, and more about that in a moment. What do you read now?
Well, I've just read Edward Crankshaw's history of the Russian Revolution from the point of view of the dynasty, the Romanovs. I'm reading Alistair Horn's book, The Fall of Paris, which deals with the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune of 1871. I have just read Saul Bellow's Humboldt's Gift.
Reread or?
No, I read it for the first time, and the energy of that book sticks to you like good hot cereal. It's just wonderful. What else have I read recently? In any case, that's the kind of reading that I'm doing now.
Is that in preparation for your
No.
next?
No.
This is pleasure.
It's pleasure, and it's fairly representative of the kind of reading I do when I'm free of writing obligations.
Well, since this book is really so visual, and you are both filmic and literary, have you ever considered the possibility of another life for the boardwalk?
Oh, sure. I mean, I guess like every novelist, I think this novel really is a movie, or would be a movie, and unlike the first one, which I think is a television series, but I think this book has a limited time span and a focused setting, and that, as you say, I do think my writing is highly visual, and yeah, sure, I think it's film.
Who plays Teddy?
Oh, I don't know.
You must
Certainly not
have
me anymore.
some casting. Who would you play? How
I'm
about
not-
Gus?
No, I'm not Gus Levi at all. I don't think.
I don't either.
No, there are none of the adults in the book that I could possibly.
That you can identify with. In the years ahead, should we expect to find more of your creative energy expressed through your writing or your TV production, or both, or what?
It's hard to predict that. Surely I will go on at WNET doing what I do, or I hope I will, but surely I will go on writing more books, because it is clearly easier for me to write books on weekends than not to write books on weekends at this point. And there are several books that I have to do sooner or later.
What are some of those books?
Oh, I can't even talk about them now. They're hard. I don't even articulate them to myself, so it's not a way of putting you off or acting coy. It's just very difficult to talk about.
If there is a message in the boardwalk that is larger and beyond what we've talked about, what is it?
There's only one message in all novels that are worth anything, I think, and that message is respect life, and that is the only message I have to deliver. And I believe that very strongly.
In your work at WNET, you respect creativity as well. And when you first came there, you produced as well as a program. Do you still do that?
I don't, and I miss it a bit. I believe in doing things to which you can attach your name and take full responsibility for. The first year I was there, I was really scared of the medium.
How'd you make the transition
Very
from
different. It was very
a
tough.
magazine to television?
It was very tough. As
Since
you know,
electronic folk are sort of resistant to...
You know that doing a monthly magazine has a kind of orderly process built in which you can control the factors that make the magazine what it is. Television is anarchy embodied in countless bodies. Half the people involved with the television production are invisible to the other half. It is very difficult to really make the connection between what evolves in one's head and then finally appears on the screen. So that was difficult for me to come to terms with. I made sure that I produced programs myself of various kinds so that I would know just how hard it is to work with tape, why it costs so much money, why it takes so long to edit this material, why it's so hard to make a lousy program, to say nothing of a good one.
What programs did you produce?
Well, I was the executive producer of the Knapp Commission hearings on television, which meant doing the hearings live in the morning from 9 until 1, then rushing uptown to an editing room and editing those 4 hours into an hour and a half highlight for the evening. And that was terrifically exciting, and I got through it only because I had such a great staff supporting me, a great unit. I thought you had to do it all yourself, as you do it as a magazine, but there were such things as producers and associate producers and directors. I was so naive at that time that I walked into our mobile unit, which was parked in front of the buildings in which the hearings were taking place, and saw those monitors, those screens up there, and under one it read CAM1, and under another it read CAM2, and under a third it was CAM3, and I thought, what does that mean? And I was too nervous to ask. It was the second day I realized it was camera 1, camera 2, camera 3. That's how little I knew. And then I produced a series of documentary films called Dateline 13, which we did locally, and then became executive producer of a national program. We did the Nureyev production of The Sleeping Beauty with Nureyev and the Canadian Ballet up in Toronto with the CBC. And then I became director of programming.
Let me ask you one quick question in the minute that we have left.
Sure.
And what do you think of television coverage of the arts in general?
I think it's splendid on WNET. I think it's absolutely a vacuum elsewhere.
Do you think there's enough of it on NET as well?
I think at the moment we're doing okay. I don't think we're doing superbly well, but I never do. Our job is to supply a complete broadcast service to this audience.
Excuse me for interrupting you. And it is that quest for perfection that makes The Boardwalk a memorable novel. Our guest today was Robert Kotlowitz, its author, and that's a book that clings to one, I guess, like its energy and vitality clings to one like a silken scarf.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us, Robert Kotlowitz. I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein, and thank you, audience, for being with us, too.